Hello, good evening. The pandemic has generated discourse, triggered discussions, and focused attention on the subject of how our cities should be reimagined and reset. In the public domain, placemaking as we define it is the experience of the spaces and places created and curated through design, often through non governmental actors. And this has been the theme of the first 4 episodes of Urban Jam. But the public domain, which consists of streets, public spaces, parks and gardens, natural landscaping between the buildings, and private realm, is primarily owned by the public, that is, governments. We all shape the city in spirit and ethos, but today we'll be discussing not just the spirit of the place, but the key instrument in shaping cities, which is decision making by the public sector. So, what are the structural and strategic instruments responsible for shaping the cities that will help us create meaningful spaces and places within the city? Here to take the discussion forward is one of Placemaking India's founding member, Nidhi Vinay, who is urban planner in the Smart Cities Mission Karnataka, and she's in Bengaluru. And from London, joining us from London is Gayatri Suryawanshi, Associate Director of Urban Planning at Tyrens, which is a Swedish company. Nidhi is an architect and urban development specialist with over 4 years of experience across the spectrum of design and planning. She completed a master's in urban management and development from the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies at Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Currently, she holds the position of urban planner at the Karnataka Smart Cities Mission. As an urban planner, her main role is to guide smart cities in planning and designing diverse urban projects, from integrate transport hubs to pedestrian safe and non-motorized transport-friendly infrastructure planning, and also planning of public transport systems through integration of IT technology. Her areas of expertise include sustainable mobility, pedestrian-safe design, placemaking and mitigating climate change, quality of life, and livable cities, and places for people and livable streets. Being with Smart Cities Mission enables her to understand better the kinds of data policy research and capacity building requires with a view to steering Indian cities to develop environmentally sustainable and smart urban spaces. Gayatri Suryawanshi is an architect and urban designer with over 14 years of experience gained through working on diverse urban projects. And currently she's working as an associate director with Swedish company Tyrens. She's experienced in managing and advising private and public sector clients on large-scale complex urban projects in the realm of urban design and landscape, urban regeneration, city strategy, and master planning, including transit-oriented development. She started her career working as an architect in Pune and was involved in the early stages of Amanora master plan, which inspired her and led to pursuing a master's in urban design. She's been working in the UK for the last 13 years, focusing on placemaking initiatives in a few London boroughs, while collaborating with multiple organizations on public realm strategies, streetscapes, and designing of public spaces. She has the ability to bridge the gap between urban design, urban planning, landscape, transport and infrastructure, and urban development to provide integrated solutions to complex urban issues. She has contributed to the initial research for recently published book, New Life in Public Spaces, authored by her mentor, Marie Burns. And she received a Master of Urban Design from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, and has graduated from the BKPS College of Architecture in Pune. So I'd like to now hand over to Nidhi, the moderator, and to take this discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinita, for the kind introduction and also this opportunity to talk about something really interesting about how to plan public spaces. And welcome to everybody here. I'm really excited to have our key speaker, Gayatri, and I look forward to hearing from her 13-year experience working with the UK government. In today's session, we will be touching upon a lot of different topics, something from planning strategies to how to engage with different sectors of the society, and also about the importance of design and including urban designers in the process of planning. So before we start the session, I thought it would be good to pose a question to all of us here. Many of us are from very diverse fields. Some are from urban planning, some are from policy making, some of you are students of urban design. So all of us have like a very different perspective on what is important when planning urban spaces. So the question is very simple. What are some of the factors that you think should be kept in mind when designing public spaces? So if everyone can just note down your answers, and towards the end of the session, we will discuss your answers and also see how and if your perspective has changed through this discussion, today's session. All right, so without further ado, I'll hand over the session to Gayatri and look forward to hearing some really good insights on how the UK government has adopted different strategies to create really beautiful and meaningful public spaces. Gayatri?
Hi, Nidhi, and hi, Vinita. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Firstly, to share my knowledge and experience from London, and also to everyone to take our time today to attend this session. So, what I'm going to just share my screen and start with the presentation just to keep in time. Okay, Vinita, can you allow me to share my screen? Perfect, thank you. I'm just going to quickly, yeah, that's the one. Just literally a second so that I can just put it on full screen. Perfect, yeah. So today, what we're going to talk about is a public realm strategy as one of the strategies generally taken forward by many planning authorities or UK local authorities. And what are these lessons learned, particularly from London as a case study today? So what's the agenda? So the agenda for our discussion is the specific lessons learned in regards with public realm and the instruments used in transformative placemaking. So to compare and understand what is the relation between the micro scale and the macro scale intervention, the emphasis will be on the macro scale approach, which looks at more permanent solutions for placemaking. And secondly, who are these key actors responsible for placemaking and what is the role of public sector, especially in placemaking? So going on to the micro scale, to begin with micro scale, what I mean by is the tactical urbanism, which has in very recent years been very much come forward as a means to address a lot of issues of places and spaces, and has flourished and significantly changed the experience and look and feel of our places in India and across the world. Every other country and local authorities or communities have tried to adopt the measures like tactical urbanism. So these are generally very impactful, quick wins and low cost. Some of these examples, such as this with a colorful crossing, and the second one, which is Bird Street, the interventions, very quick interventions in Bird Street and Tooley Street as a parklet, demonstrate the creative and artistic expressions to animate the public realm. But what are these? Whether these should be look at these as a very short-term measures, or these are the long-term changes that we are focusing on. But in London, I think, however, these are derived out of a macro scale strategy. So going on to a macro scale and highlighting the ongoing discussion of what all the global cities are thinking about and talking about is how should our cities be structured? Because if we want these smaller spaces or macro scale spaces come out of a bigger a strategy, we need to look at the cities completely differently. So for every global city, from whether it's Paris or Melbourne to Ottawa in Canada, they have all been discussing the concepts of sustainable growth, which is primarily based on proximity of uses, or diversity of uses, and density and multimodal transport in order to transform their cities into whether it's a 15-minute city or a 20-minute city. So Paris, for example, is trying to address it as a 15-minute city. I think that's this question, again, reiterating on Nidhi's question, is perhaps I think we should all think about in the context of India, and probably discuss at the end of the session, is how we can apply something, or formulate similar sort of initiatives or strategies for Indian cities, especially not only for the metro cities, but all the smaller cities, because they have a benefit of that scale. And I think that it's very easy to address, some of these or emulate some of these strategies, whether it's a planning strategy or transport strategy for a smaller scale cities. So that's something for us, all of us, to think about in the context of Indian cities. But what is London trying to do? So this is a London draft plan, currently in its draft format. It's will be released probably by end of this year or next year. So what is London doing? It's essentially, as you can see from this plan, it's promoting and planning for growth and intensification along its transport corridors, with many new transport infrastructures planned, such as a Crossrail and HS2 and other regional transport sort of address, which connects the gateways to the city, and regionally it connects it to the other cities in the England. It has identified, this plan identifies all the colored zones, as you can see in the plan, are the areas which are the opportunity areas where the growth in next 20, 30 years will be intensified and focused on, to promote a sort of a very compact and sustainable growth. The map shows, these very small regional public transport networks, which are the sort of the blue lines and the dashed lines and the north pink lines, all of those. And to identify what the network is, where the connection should be, and where we want people to move, and where those people should be start living in the next 20 years. And these opportunity areas will be closely looked at through various planning instruments, one of which is a public realm strategy. So just to give a bit of an overview of our planning system, it's a very complex system in the UK with multiple strategies, some statutory, some non-statutory, but they are undertaken to support and understand and have a vision for any place or any district. So what is a public realm strategy? So looking at a macro scale, which is not completely, you can't have a public realm strategy for a city level, though at a district level, it's certainly feasible and possible to focus on. So what, with the goal for every district, for any country, any place, there will always be to create this very interesting, connected, safe, legible, attractive, vibrant and accessible public realm for a district, which sort of brings all the built form and a built environment, including buildings, and uses everything together in sort of a very interesting and animated sort of a platform. So how do we, in London, how we focus on these preparation of these public realm strategies is through a very detailed thematic assessment of various, say for example, the movement patterns, so whether it's pedestrians, cycles or vehicles, what is a public transport node for any district, what are the gateways, where are the transport nodes, where are the bus stops and everything, and well, what are the land uses and destinations. Once there is a defined area of a strategy, I think all of these different layers and assessment of these layers come together to understand what that place is. Specifically, not to neglect, something like its quality in itself, whether it's a cultural and heritage sort of assets within that district, and the ecology, most importantly, and the open spaces within that district. So when all of these layers, different layers, come together to form sort of an understanding of the area, I think it starts to create sort of a framework that sets out a vision for the spaces between the buildings. So it can be any space, whether it's a road, street, transport corridor, or a network, or a public space, or even a play area. I think it sets out a very clear, well-defined vision, and that's a public realm strategy. But any strategy is sort of incomplete without a implementation plan. So certainly a delivery plan, which includes sort of the costing or identification of specific sort of interventions or projects that come out of it, and how they should be delivered, how they should be phased, how they should be funded, and what are the interdependencies on the rest of the areas. I think those need to be noted down and sort of explained, because that forms sort of a strategy for next 15 to 20 years. So that's not something that can be delivered in like a year or so, but that forms a sort of a long-term sort of a plan. And along with that, a management and a maintenance plan, which explains how all of these spaces and places have to be managed and who is responsible for management. In management, in not terms only of waste management, of cleanliness or other aspects, but also safety, lighting, and many other sort of social, to address many of the social issues. So how all of these things come together, that's primarily what is a public realm strategy. in the UK. That's how we understand as a public realm strategy. So looking at, specific today strategy that sets out for different areas, what I've tried to do is explain sort of in 3 different examples. So, and primarily why these examples are picked up is because also they are along the Crossrail corridor, because all the opportunity areas are along Transport Corridor, and Crossrail being one of those high footfall or high capacity new rail infrastructure. It's going to bring in a lot of people or move a lot of people from one place to the other. So the reliance on public transport is entirely, through these, and creating places along these networks is super important. So these first 3 examples of public realm strategies is Oxford Street District, and the Moorgate area enhancement, and ILFORD public realm strategy. All of these 3 different strategies are very distinct in their own way, and what they explain is how each of these areas are looked at in a very place-based approach. So they have their bespoke set of challenges, bespoke set of solutions as well at the same time. So firstly, going into Oxford Street, which is a project initiated by Transport for London and Westminster City Council, with the aspiration to transform this street, which is a sort of a vehicular, or rather say public transport dominated street, into a world-class shopping center. So how do you transform this street into something of an international reputation? Firstly, I think what we tried to address as consultants and being part of the design team was to not look at the street in its isolation, but look at the street in a sort of its context of its ecosystem, its influence zone, and a wider district. So by identifying it as a district is a first step of acknowledging that no street or place works in isolation, certainly. So the solution was to pedestrianize Oxford Street, to respond to many challenges from the economic growth. How do we bring all the diverse land uses together? How do we address the challenges of the bad air quality in central London, specifically on this street? So to address all of those challenges, I think the solution was to pedestrianize Oxford Street, along with many other north and south sort of the secondary streets, to boost or sort of address all of these challenges. Then, through that sort of an approach, a place-based approach of understanding as a district, through diverting traffic to understanding whether it's a reduction in traffic or diversion of traffic, I think it was only then we could understand, okay, is it possible to create pedestrian street as Oxford Street as a pedestrian street? And obviously the solution was based in sort of, if we have to focus Oxford Street as a key in terms of its hierarchy of spaces within that district, then what the experience on Oxford Street should be. So the design of the street was primarily based on a sort of interesting place-based data collection and analysis, such as a desire line. So where people want to move, what are the key shops or attractors where people move into or come out of it? And what are the behavioral patterns where people like to pause, sit, take some rest, because this is a very long street. It's almost like a kilometer street. So you won't be expecting people to just run up and down, but I think there would be places of pause and relaxation. So what are those? And it's all based on a very in-depth understanding of the analysis of how people behave on such streets, basically. Similarly, moving on to Moorgate area, which is an equivalent of a central business district, as we know in India. And it's a business and financial district in London, City of London, or the old City of London. And so how do we transform this very sort of business and office and commercial space related sort of district and harmonize it to create more pedestrian and at the ground level be a bit more convivial and sort of vibrant, is through interventions that sort of understand where people want to move, where they will be focusing on, where the cars and vehicles and pedestrians have to move, what are the heritage assets, and where are these places, very small interventions that can enhance that sort of experience on these multiple streets within this district. And not to mention, and most important aspect of the City of London is the heritage assets, with many sort of listed and interesting buildings. What is also imperative is to enhance their setting, to be able to appreciate those buildings and the architecture of the city. So through very simple interventions and redistribution of spaces from not just from cars to pedestrians, but to cyclists and for tree planting. I think many of those challenges of this area were addressed with probably more simpler and close to tactile sort of intervention. So City of London actually has a very similar approach for many of it has divided its borough in many of these different districts. So what it tries to do is replicate or sort of emulate a similar process for every district or every small district by addressing very place space and specific challenges of each of those. So this is one of the other strategies that we prepared, which is for the Cheapside, Guildhall and Cheapside area, which is sort of adjacent to Moorgate area, looking at similar approaches of how we address the challenges of especially vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists, and creating those interesting places along these very interesting and heritage assets such as the St. Paul's or Museum of London, and how to enhance the connectivity and create those cultural sort of linkages between the spaces. Then moving on to ILFORD, which is slightly a different case compared to, say, Oxford Street and Moorgate, which are in central London and have a very different set of challenges. Whereas ILFORD, being on the periphery of London and being one of the town centres at the edge of London, is a residential sort of an borough area, which has its many challenges within its town centre. So as you can see in this sort of a diagram, is that there are these very interesting pockets along the transport nodes, which will be the areas of intensification. So ILFORD town centre is one of those where the Crossrail station will be, upcoming Crossrail station will be. It has its own challenges of intensification. And housing provision being one of those major sort of issues across London, I think provision of housing and intensification in particular spots is sort of those challenges which have to be addressed through a holistic and a comprehensive sort of a view of how places can be seen. So particularly for ILFORD, as you can see, it's a very diverse sort of place with shopping and a very interesting street in itself, which has shopping centers, but at the same time residential. It's a very mixed use place, which is undergoing sort of a significant intensification by bringing in like thousands of new homes, which will bring in thousands of new people into this place. So how do we address those challenges, or sort of bring closer the existing communities and the new communities and the facilities together through this public realm strategy to create a very convivial and a vibrant new quarter where the new communities can call ILFORD as their home. So with all of these different strategies, as you can see, I think there is some sort of a commonality as in who takes a lead. So I think what it brings to the second point on our agenda is who takes a lead. In case of London and specifically UK, I think facilitating, that kind of a dialogue or conversation between various actors is always a public sector who sort of facilitates that sort of a management or a planning of growth, but at the same time managing all of those relationships between sort of whether it's with private sector, civil society, or the community and the citizens. So how does it do that? And what are those specific, the aspects of these relationships, which kind of leads to this whole exercise of creating a very different district, or looking forward to create something very interesting districts, how that can be put forward. So when we look at these specific relationships, say between the public sector and the private sector, it's important to understand that although many places delivered by the private sector, they are certainly within a framework of a local plan. So so there is a specific relationship between the public sector and the private sector, and collaborative relationship essentially. But apart from for the private sector to deliver any sort of a built environment, new sort of built environment, I think it comes with sort of challenges and the planning obligations, which is it's bound by planning obligations to sort of address not only the site within which it's going to develop, but also contribute towards the improvement of the overall district, because any development in any area will have its own sort of an impact on a wider area. So to mitigate those impacts, I think the private sector is bound by sort of these obligations, which they are probably sort of, I won't say forces or compulsive, but it is compulsive in a way, and asks for financial contributions in the form of, say, Section 106, which is a particular sort of a planning section, and a community infrastructure levy. So which is the contributions could be in monetary, financial. There are very different measures within the planning system in the UK, which tries to understand, how the private contribute towards the development of the wider district and specific the red line boundary within the site which they're working towards. Similarly, I think they can also have a very different relationship, particularly in London and many other places in the UK, where there are business improvement districts, which are sort of a coming together of many businesses together to form sort of a organization which kind of manages and supports the local authorities in creating supporting sort of the management of the district. To sort of organize events or bringing art into the public realm. So those are the kind of different various ways of, or measures already put in place in the planning system, whereby I think they can collaboratively work towards improving any sort of public domain, essentially. The second sort of relationship, which is very interesting, one is between the private public sector and the civil society. Some of these organizations I've listed down. There are many more such organizations in the UK, but specifically the ones that who are very active and very much vocal or emphasize or champion for a particular aspect is some of these ones here, such as the Living Streets Group in London, a Design Council, Sustrans, and Urban Design London. So apart from supporting the local authorities, they also sort of strive or work towards improving the quality of design, whether it's quality of just not design by architecture, but also public spaces, public realm, cycle lanes, or even street furniture for that matter. So having, sort of these different groups who champion for different aspects, I think it only adds to that professional sort of a layer which enriches the experience in London. And one of the most interesting ones, I think, is the Urban Design London, which along with supporting the council also helps them and sets out sort of these different design review panels. So the objective of the design review panel is to provide that professional peer review for any project that comes forward for planning. Which is very interesting sort of a platform for many professionals to come together and discuss the new ways and innovation into planning system or design and urban design. So it's not only sufficient to adhere to the building regulations or the planning regulations. I think design is something that's very well discussed and understood in the fraternity. So this is a very sort of an interesting sort of aspect which the civil society brings into the public sector work. And the most important one, not the last one certainly, is the relationship between the public sector and the community. This is an ongoing sort of a relationship. It's not only limited at a project sort of engagement, but it's very much an ongoing communication between the two. So there is a constant sort of, in various forms, there is a communication between the two sort of parties, which is very well managed by the public sector essentially. But essentially when there are projects or when there are changes in the district, when there are sort of public realm strategies proposed for any district, what is it that the process that they have to go through, what the public sector goes through to understand whether the community is included within that whole process, to understand their opinions, take their feedback, feed into the strategy, and also consult with them as in how they would like to be involved in various ways. So I think what is important to understand with the London case study is that all of these different interesting public realm strategies, which are multiple for every other place. There are many other strategies that are prepared apart from public realm strategies. They all go through these different ways of communication and ways of engagement with the public. And these are done in very interesting and different, used by different modes and ways and methods of engaging in consensus building. So not just informing the public. Early stages, yes, you have to inform the public what is happening in the sort of a district, in the borough, but engaging them with sort of asking questions or conducting interviews or surveys or organizing events as in what they really want from there in a place, and collaborating in also design. So we've also been sort of part of workshops where we invite the residents and the community to collaborate and sort of sorry, is there going to be a meeting? Can I just continue, Vinita? This is the last slide anyways. Yeah. I can't hear you, sorry, Vinita. You're mute.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Do continue. We have unlimited minutes. So,
Oh, fantastic. Okay, fantastic. It's a last slide anyway, so that's coming to an end of everything. So what I was just continuing was on these various forms and mediums of communication that the public sector uses to communicate with its community and citizens. And so I think it sort of reflecting on, what I understand about India, and having been away from India for a lot of years actually, but being very much in touch with, what is happening in India, what we really want from our cities, and going back to India very often, all I can say or conclude probably, and reflecting from UK experience, is that the role of transport planners and the public sector and urban planner is becoming ever so important to have that vision and have that sort of an understanding where we want to take our cities and in what direction we want to take our cities. Because it's kind of at the point of a threshold, or rather the cross intersection, where we really need to understand, what Indian cities mean, because climate change is something that's always, sort of a daunting sort of a challenge for every other place across the world. So I think what are these, different challenges at macro level, at the global level, at the city level? How do we address that? And I think a role of a public sector in that sort of an perspective is becoming ever more important, because there has to be a certain body who sort of manages and controls and facilitates all of this dialogue and is accountable and responsible for delivering sort of these measures and outcomes of those strategies. So thank you very much for giving me such a time. I'm sorry for this really long monologue, but open to any questions now. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Nidhi, yes.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Gayatri. There are a couple of questions that I had in mind, even when you were giving the presentation, but I didn't want to disturb you. So one of the first things I was thinking is you're right, the public sector should take a lead. But then I was wondering even for the public sector to take a lead, it needs to have a vision. And so how important is having a vision for either the city on the whole, or a borough, in the case of UK? How important is that vision in establishing or guiding this, what happens at the end, a planning process and the strategies that follow?
I think in my personal experience and opinion, I think vision is a very important aspect. Having vision for any district, which has to come out of its, sort of an understanding of that place. So when I said, these place-based analysis and approaches to understand a place, I think they sort of lead you to that vision. So having, setting out a vision is very important, because that sets out sort of a pipeline or sort of a direction for growth. Not having a vision, it only means that the public sector is going to be more reactionary rather than more proactively working towards something better. And having a plan is, as we always know, even in our very everyday lives, we have to have a plan for certain things to achieve certain things. Yes. So having that very good, clear sort of a strategy and a plan, although flexible at the same time, is very important and to sort of work towards funding, allocation of funds and budgets towards it is equally important. And that's why I think having a plan or one vision is super important to bring everyone together. If that makes sense, yeah.
Yes, that really does. But that's also very interesting, because you're saying planning of budgets after having a vision, which is really beautiful in a different sense, that so when half of these public realm strategies are envisioned, are budgets already allocated, or it is after the visioning of the plan and consultation and realizing what potential each public realm has? Is it after that this budgeting and allocation of funds is thought through?
So how we start, Nidhi, is that every public realm strategy, or rather any strategy, it starts with a catalyst. There is some sort of a reason to, start to do that. Like in case of London, I think with all of these public sort of infrastructure investment, I think they've only triggered, sort of that understanding, okay, if we have a public transport node, you have to have a vision for that area. Yeah, it's not only good enough to say that, yeah, we're going to allow at peak times, thousands of people come out of the station. How do they move from that, one station? Because we don't want to rely on cars. So we want to allow a very nice district where it's more legible for people to understand and where they want to go and how they want to go. So having that, sort of that catalyst that, okay, we have to look at this area in a very different way, in itself sets out the reason for the vision. So once you have that, sort of that push or first sort of a step or initiative, once you have the vision and then you create a vision, you start understanding there has to be certain measures. You prioritize and deprioritize some of the measures. So there will be certain things that you have to address right at the front to make more, to ease the improvement and or functioning of that district. And then I think there will always be that first set of projects, which are priority projects, would need certain amount of funding and finance. Yes. So I think that sometimes, most of the times, comes out of the council budgets. I mean, even before that, the preparation of this vision or the strategies in itself it's a budget that is always allocated for. But that's always allocated for because you definitely need a vision. And the projects, I think, which are identified within the strategy, they come with a costing, a financial plan, funding plans, or, sort of, they give you an idea whether, how much it would cost to implement that. And then the councils have to work towards, sort of phasing them. So you can't really allocate a budget for 10 years. You can allocate budget every year. So you can address, every one project every year. So it's a long-term process. It's not something short-term.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to try to get out of this. The fact that the public realm strategy is a very long-term planning process, and it's actually at a very macro scale, not even at the complete city scale, but then for each borough, which is very interesting. Because in India, I don't think that level of detailed planning has started as yet. Even though Smart Cities Mission suggests, my cat is disturbing me as usual. So even though the Smart Cities Mission has kind of started some level of this kind of local but not very detailed planning, is area-based development. So they're identified a certain area within which they know that they want to improve or retrofit certain parts of the area, including slum rehabilitation, redevelopment. But it's still not very personal. It's not personal to the borough. It's still with a bigger vision in mind, where they're I need to have these many projects established in this, because it is also a pilot initiative. So, but this is the public realm strategy is really beautiful because it's more personal and it's more context oriented, and that's nice.
I think with the smart cities, I think smart cities is one aspect or sort of one layer of a strategy. It's not the entire. It's not as comprehensive as an urban plan or area action plans are. Yes, I mean, I think every sort of initiative needs its own sort of an understanding of the place. They all are all the strategy, even in the UK, I think they all are separate. So region strategy is different than a financial strategy for an area, or transport mobility strategy is different from a public realm strategy. They all are different because you have to look at them in detail. But I think that at some point they do come together to understand and how they all need to function sort of seamlessly. Your cat seems to have a lot of opinion, Nidhi. She wants to be part of the whole conversation.
Yes, she does. She's where's my dedicated space for scratching? Okay, so another thing was when you were talking about Leicester Square. Leicester Square is a very good example of private sector involvement and development, taking up the entire project on, right? Was it Leicester Square or was it the other one?
It was Granary Square, King's Cross, yeah. So King's Cross is one of those very interesting projects, which is of a creation of a completely new public space in London. Because as we have previously discussed, I think in London there are many public spaces, but having created this new, completely brand new public space has its own challenges, and especially on a private land, it had its many challenges. But I think that the private sector who developed this quarter has a very good vision and understanding of the place and the assets, because most of the buildings and quite a few buildings in the King's Cross development, they are of cultural and sort of the heritage value. So I think bringing out them and creating a public space, it's only sort of brought about same sort of ethos about London, that you have to celebrate what you have already, the assets of what you have. And what is interesting with King's Cross is obviously the responsibility the private sector took in creating sort of that public realm, not just one public space, but across the district, creating that very interesting public realm and managing and maintaining that public realm. Certainly, and through their own, certainly their own funds, because it's possible for a private sector to attract that kind of funding from global sort of investors, essentially.
What was like the gain for the public sector in that entire project? Like apart from obviously creating really beautiful public space, you were saying that by creating a lovely public space, you also improve the entire economic value of the surrounding neighborhood. And
Absolutely. So I think what the public sector and how it focuses on all of these is it's almost like doing things collaboratively. So even though the place space, that's why the place, I keep repeating myself, but this place space approach is very important, because having a good understanding of what that place needs, whether it's for whoever delivers it, whether it's public sector or private sector, what a place needs is one of the key ingredients to agree upon at the outset of the project. If it needs a public space and if it has that quality to address that, I think even if it's delivered by private, it's probably something that should be done. And then how to come together and deliver it between the private sector and public sector. There are many instruments and mechanisms in the UK within the planning system and the financial, how they finance the projects is to address those challenges. But I think it doesn't sort of limit them. All of these, the mechanisms, there are multiple mechanisms to address it. And I think that's what is the beauty of all of these, because it doesn't come to the forefront in the sense that even though it's a private space, it's still used and is allowed for public. So I think that's where the boundaries of private and public are sort of blurred when they start to set out, any project.
Yeah. Vinita, did you have any question?
Actually, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I just wondered, there's also always an issue of gentrification when, when the private sector sort of enters in, and because it's sort of always tied to the agenda of high rises, luxury flats, and that pushes out the residents of the original residents in the neighborhood. And I just wondered if you had any, ploys, strategies to manage that. There are two ways of looking at it. Some people feel, okay, our neighborhood is actually improved. There's less crime. There's less there's better garbage collection. Looks more pleasant. But at the same time, there is a phenomenon in London of, artists certainly have been driven out by gentrification, and so this is something. Whereas I think property rights are very strong in India, but still. This is an issue that I'd love to hear your views on this.
I have, with public realm strategies particularly, there's very less sort of exposure to this kind of a real estate land use market, certainly. But as far as my understanding goes, when we have these, say for example, ILFOD, which is a very much, sort of that kind of a community, which was an existing community, there is still an existing community there. And by intensification, it by means of that, it brings in more people and sort of displaces a certain number of people. But I think the local authorities are very sensitive about, all of these sort of issues. And there is always an aspect, sort of they're striving to retain or maintain, sort of not not go ahead with gentrification, but in that kind of a spirit where everybody is displaced from one to the other, but trying to retain the residents in as many numbers as they are in the same sort of a borough, at least. So when there is these new housing developments, there is certainly an element of allocation for various tenure mixes. So whether it's for rental or social housing or affordable housing or any other ways of housing, I think there is always that allocation within any new development. So I think there are different ways they address it, certainly to be more sort of sensitive towards more social issues.
Yeah, I was actually wondering also that I think I remember reading somewhere that in the new planning bylaws or in the housing sector schemes for London, they have to allocate 23% to social housing or
That's right.
So that's one way of ensuring that even if some level of change is going to happen within an area, like even if you're getting pushed from your immediate local neighborhood, you're still within the entire borough. Because right? Right. That's because that's something that actually India doesn't really have very clearly defined in its, and I don't actually know from even other cities and countries.
Correct.
Um,
And if any other,
okay.
oh, sorry, Nidhi, go ahead. I was wondering if any other participants had questions. Isha, anybody else had any questions?
Yeah, I was actually, I was considering the gentrification aspect of it. So I was wondering if, there's scope for bottom-up approaches as well to counter the gentrification by, if there is scope for the whole grassroots plus top-down efforts in London particularly, if that would work in the regeneration of these urban spaces.
See, I think I see these two aspects completely differently because, public spaces is a sort of a public entity and creation of, that network spaces. When it comes to gentrification or all of these kind of built and sort of issues related to land uses, I think there are many sort of instruments where even, for example, the public consultation, I think where you have to sort of, when any development comes forward, I think they have to sort of put out the numbers of, what the social housing will be and all of these. So I think those are definitely the points where they take the feedback from the communities. They understand what the community wants. And if there is already a community, a strong community, I think all of their points, and there are groups, certainly there are groups who would be very much vocal about if they don't accept any sort of plans. So that is very much voice. So there is definitely a sort of bottom-up response and a top-down sort of an answer or being accountable for, addressing all of those sort of questions and the points that the community raises.
Excellent. Nidhi, did you have any further questions or?
Yeah. I wanted to know actually some the role of the public sector. I mean, the relationship between public sector and the civil society, because I found very interesting because most of the time here we are also trying to understand, and the civil society is also really struggling to like collaborate with the government because most of the time it's kind of the voice of the people, and because obviously the government is not listening to its people, and so how there's a lot of reclamation projects on the different parts of NGOs and different kinds of CSOs are collaborating or pitching, the people's voices. But I think I really like the whole urban design review.
Yeah, urban design, London,
Yeah, London. So that was also a very interesting collaboration with designers, like, because that is also like how much do urban designers really bring onto the table when planning and designing spaces and public spaces. And the fact that there is a lovely review panel that encourages this dialogue between even urban designers who are just like part of the city. They're not necessarily a part of the government or working with the government, but at least they get a chance to really participate in the designing process. Could you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. So I think the good point, with the public sector and private sector in terms of this expertise and the level of skills, I think there is always a gap, that comes everywhere in every country and every sort of place. But I think in London, because there are professionals like urban design architects, urban planners, transport planners in the public sector, at the same time outside as consultancies are private sectors. So I think that the awareness of a basic understanding of any profession or what the skills and expertise they can bring about, I think that's at least the bar is very high already, essentially. And what it with such design review panels it does is that actually it starts to bring them much closer in the profession. So sort of many urban designers, urban planners coming together and discussing a project. It already enriches that sort of an understanding or raises the bar of design. So not having just to satisfy the base minimum planning regulations is good enough. Because in a city, I think innovation, creativity has a very big role essentially in, sort of pushing our professional sort of expertise all the time. I think pushing that envelope is extremely important to, bring about the change and look at things very differently and also talk about all of those very pressing issues, pressing our, whether it's materials, character, architecture, ways of designing or addressing sort of climate issues through built environment. So I think that in itself is a very good opportunity. And what Urban Design London does is that it helps the council, the local authorities, by setting up these panels. So the panel is made up of all the professionals, essentially. So the professionals, so like if I'm a sort of an individual private sector professional, I can be on the panel by myself, and then there are many other professionals similar. And we all sort of provide that extra layer of professional feedback on any project that comes forward for planning. So by going through this design review panels, what it sort of tries to do is that it's a fantastic opportunity to bring as many designers to talk about it, essentially. And all of that sort of that feedback is captured by the public sector, because all of that is, the public sector uses that to understand or even push their boundary in terms of quality of design across the borough. So it's not only about one project, but it's across the borough, how we can improve the quality of design. So I think these kind of platforms definitely brings or enhances, the sort of the level of expertise and skills of the public sector by providing these panels to them. I think that's very important in terms of, not to undermine or the role of public sector, saying that they have limited resources. They always will have limited resources generally. But I think this kind of augments their resources, augments their expertise through these design review panels.
Yeah, that's right, because recently something happened in India. Like the government decided that they wanted to redesign like the parliament entire stretch in Delhi, and there was a huge uproar from everybody, from the people, and especially civil society designers like the Institute for Urban Designers, INTAC, and even landscape architects. So even that society all came together and developed like a really detailed assessment of what the space already means to the public, to the city around. So like you can already see that there is a presence for people, and people have a very good idea of their public space, and what it means, and what kind of value it adds to their life. So the fact that the government is going ahead and doing something without their consent, they're already like standing up and saying, no, this is not okay. So yeah, it's very nice to have that dialogue, and like the government should, and the fact that UK government encourages that is very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's also, for Indian context, I think with, such projects, which are very high profile projects, they kind of, change our, because they raise a sort of an image in everybody's head, every citizen's head, about that place. And that's what they appreciate about it. I think providing these sort of a platform, okay, so even if it's at central government level or at a cities or like Delhi level, I think providing a platform for all the professionals to sort of put their views across, and then the government has to sort of either respond to them, formally. Because it starts to create that formal process of, the expertise and, share of knowledge and understanding of things. So I think that kind of definitely is a possibility, because there is already that, the awareness in the professionals in India, obviously, and there is sort of they want to bring about the change. It's just that there is no platform to do that yet.
Exactly. Yeah. Could you also tell me a little bit about the council? Because I think the council, as far as what I remember reading, is that it's not only focused on design, but it's also focused on various other sectors of planning, or?
Absolutely. I mean, all local authorities, I think that's very similar to probably for India. Like local authorities, they should have their own departments, whether it's for ecology, landscape, environment, or even for urban design, urban planning. So all of these professionals, there is a counterpart of, these professionals in the public sector itself. And also, I think to add to your point of, urban design London, that's something very interesting point is that London's Mayor of London also has sort of a separate advisory body. So they are the mayor's advisors. So they are for the built environment, because the Mayor of London, he sort of manages the GLA, the Greater London Authority, and Transport for London. So I think they have a lot of these conversations about what London means and in what way, we can shape London in different ways, and us as a global city. So there are these different, like 40 odd advisors appointed every 2 years to that panel, and they are selected from the industry, from private sector. So they are in themselves, but like, renowned architects, urban designers, practitioners who are appointed on that sort of a role. And they sort of advise these local authorities, whether it's GLA or Transport London, on various of these projects. So like, for example, Oxford Street, London, had to go through this Mayor's Design Advisory Board. Yeah. So they had to go through a review through that. And like ILFORD had to go through review of the design review of Redbridge Authority. So all of these projects have to go through these review boards, because that only adds or, enriches that whole quality.
Right. I was also thinking about public sector and citizen engagement. Like when you say, like towards the end, towards the end of your presentation, you were saying that and that's the real beauty of London, the fact that I know that it is ingrained in the system to really reach out and make sure everybody hears and everybody at least has knowledge of the fact that something like this is going to happen. And then even though there are surveys and pamphlets out there, I was wondering, like, how often does that, because the process is very cumbersome, I can understand. So how often does that process of consultation happen, at least for public realm strategy, like if just for this? Because the scale of the public realm strategy is also very approachable. Like you don't have to like really consider the entire city or the population of the entire city. So then how often do those interactions, consultations, discussions happen? And just what role does, like, who takes on that role? That role, I'm sure that even the public sector has to do it, but if they can't handle it, then is there an opportunity for the civil society to come in and, provide that service? Because
definitely. So I think what is important is that, when these public realm strategies, they are not, developed every year or so. Okay. There are, these strategies have a life of their own. Once one strategy is developed, I think it has its project which go through a certain life. And when it starts to become, sort of that there is a need for a new strategy, because there will be certain changes in the borough which will bring about a need for new strategies. So when these strategies are being prepared and released and adopted, I mean, that's a very planning sort of a process. They go through a very rigorous understanding of, what the community wants, definitely. So it depends on the scale of the strategy, scale of the project, how significant and how small the interventions are, how big the interventions are. I think they will go through that robust process. So every project is looked at very differently, okay? So every project, so even like, for example, Oxford Street strategy, it had to go through a very robust sort of a public consultation process, talking to various groups, often, like very often, every few weeks, like meeting various different groups of people, because there will always be representatives of community, shopping, or the retailers, or the businesses, and many offices are commercial. So I think meeting everybody is very important. Understanding what they want from the district is important. Then doing a very formal consultation, which is about, putting forth the designs or, what the plans are, and taking views on those. So definitely it's a part of the surveys, and that goes across. So I think that's a very formal process. But before going on to a formal process, there are all of these, they're still part of the process, but engagement, it's more of a dialogue to understand what they want. And at the formal process, it's all very much captured, whether, it's acceptable by them or not acceptable, by the public, whatever the interventions are. And that's how the projects are. So and even after, let's say the project does go ahead, if it does go ahead from the public, that it's acceptable, it's very much a support from the public. During construction or many other phases, I think there is a constant sort of communication, what is happening. They are being told in various ways what is happening in the borough, what is happening in the project, at what stage the project is at the moment, and if there is any disruption to their lives, which is going to cause. So all of this is a very sort of a continuous process on really, whereas the plans, when they are released, they are different.
Yeah, no, I was just wanting to get it clear so that people don't get confused. Is that so the Oxford Street strategy is one project, one aspect, right? But like for ILFORD, I'm sure the ILFORD public realm strategy was a mix of various different little projects, right? Because some of these public realm strategies are made up of like many different, like you said, I think
Yeah.
in the beginning of the presentation, you said that you need to first identify and prioritize what needs to get done first.
Yeah.
And then, so yeah, I think that even that breaking down of what needs to be done to achieve this greater vision also makes it easier for the public sector to handle this public consultation, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because once when there are certain enhancement projects, there is a very less sort of an objection, because already there is a place, it needs to be enhanced, so there's less
Right.
objection. When a project like Oxford Street, where you have to transform from a bus to a pedestrian, that's a major transformation. That attracts a lot more different sort of a conversation. But these are very much managed differently, and in a very different scale. And answering to your previous question about how we can always bring on an expert or specialist on such aspects, that is always a possibility, because this is when we are doing a project like this, I think it's always a public sector who manages this relationship, but it's very much the consultants, everybody involved in the project, they have to go through this process of public consultation. But in certain circumstances, which particularly with Oxford Street, we also had a very interesting specialist who was managing that relationship on the behalf of. So it's not really a completely privatized kind of a process. It's very much as a consultant, they manage the process, yes. There are many, many consultants like that in the UK who kind of support the public sector and the consultants. So because it's a collaborative work at that point, because the designs are put forward by consultants. I think they have to be sort of in agreement or in sort of agreement of what the aspirations are. So how to manage that communication is something that is definitely supported by the consultant in some cases.
Yeah. I think the reason I brought up this topic was only because, like, again, with Smart Cities Mission and with a lot of the efforts that are happening in India, the government in general does not have like the capacity, as in even knowledge wise, even the people wise, like how do you go and approach different kinds of people in the society? How do you really ensure that the message of of the project is planned in a different way for the different parts of the society, sectors of society? So then that's when you really need to, like, at least open up this communication aspect to the civil society or even consultants, even the private sector. And I think that's what we're actually kind of hoping that will happen, I think, by the end of the Smart Cities Mission, because there is some level of interaction with all the different sectors that is finally happening. It has not happened all this while in in planning in India. So which is really nice. And it is not that it's being pushed across from the public side or like the civil society side or the private side, but actually being taken forward by the government itself. They're like, okay, who do we need to reach out to really get this done thoroughly? Like that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think having that. Having that idea of who we need to consult, I think that's the first part of it. Any project will have its own influence zone and an impact zone. So I think understanding who will be impacted by that is a first step to the stakeholder engagement. And there are obviously, when we do projects in the UK, there is always that stakeholder engagement strategy as well alongside the public realm strategy. So which starts. Yeah. So which starts to talk about, okay, who we need to address at what intervals, what kind of communication we need to do. I think that is always very systematically, done, because a communication during, certain times like school holidays or Christmas time or things when it will sort of not bring or reach out to many people, that's not a good timing. So the timing is as important as ever as well with any project or any communication. You have to allow people to, take it in and sort of respond to your queries or your whatever information you put out there, and allow them time to react to that. So I think all of these things are well thought through at the beginning of the project, generally.
Yeah. Vinita, you had something to say?
No, I'm just absorbing everything. It's been a great dialogue, because it's probably the most interaction we've had between the moderator and the speaker on any of the Urban Jam sessions. So thank you for enriching the discourse so much, and with your personal experience, Nidhi, and Gayatri, your
Isha, did you have anything to say? I think somebody was trying to say something in between that. I was wondering.
Okay. So I just, there's just so many takeaways, but I love what you said. No street works in isolation, and it's part of a district. That really, this session really justified the time to look at a more systemic way of planning, areas like the district, not just one street, but a more macro level planning, and what gains uh, can come from aligned with the private sector. It probably is, probably a precursor to another session on what are the perils of this. But I'd like to thank Gayatri for the extraordinary experience you brought to this, and this will be on this recording will be on our YouTube channel, and I'm sure many people will gain from it. And we'd like to solicit your support for future activities as well. I mean, like the creating a design council equivalent, or what did you call the urban?
Yeah.
Design?
Yeah, the design council. Yes,
there's certainly scope for that. Yeah, putting design first before civil engineering. So
certainly, I think I read a very interesting article like last week, which was authored by WRI, and it said that having vision is important because obviously in Indian context, it's the civil or the public sector is made up of engineers, and very less so with designers. So I think that's the biggest disparity of or the rather the not unfortunate but an opportunity that to address definitely.
Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to put in another word because I was thinking when you're talking about vision, no? I think it's also really important that the private sector also has a vision for the city or the area, because we're all part of the same space, and we're all gaining and interacting in the same space. So how important is it that the private sector has a very good vision? Because right now, I think in India, Yulu, the startup, the electric mobility, shared mobility startup, is really redefining how people are going to move in this city, in Bangalore especially. And and the fact that he's really pushing for it, and really because there is a vision there, and really enabling a lot of people who can't move, especially during now because of COVID and public transport systems being affected by this. If it wasn't for Yulu, it would have been, I mean, and many of the shared mobility services also, if it wasn't for that part of that sector of the city, that this new kind of the new kind of character of the city would not have come out at all. So
correct. Yeah,
it's very,
I'm not very much aware of what that body does, but yeah, I mean, I completely support your, the sort of that feeling about, how the public sector or the consultants can all think about a new ways of, looking at the cities completely. Definitely.
Yeah.
okay.
Vinita?
Yes, okay. With that, I'll stop the recording, and do join us, everybody, for the next Urban Jam, which will actually be on August 14th, which is which is the eve of Indian Independence Day. We have a very interesting program which involves Lahore, Old Delhi, the two sisters. It's a tale of two sisters. So I hope you'll all join us there. Thank you so much, Nidhi, Gayatri, and all the other participants. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Nidhi.
Thank you, Gayatri.